Hi, I'm Justina Kostek.
And I'm Don Rittner.
Today we're going to continue our adventure on the Great Western Turnpike.
And we're going to learn about the first steam-powered passenger train in America and the mysteries of Esperance, New York.
So come along for the ride on History on the Road.
We left off at our last adventure visiting one of America's earliest glass factories and the first church in Duanesburg, New York, which almost became the capital of New York State thanks to New York City Mayor James Duane, who purchased thousands of acres here in upstate New York in the 18th century. Today we're going to learn more about Duane's son-in-law, General William North, and his role in the American Revolution. Another important resident of Duanesburg was George Featherstonhaugh, also pronounced Fenenshaw. George lived close to General North and was married to Sarah Duane, one of the daughters of Mayor James Duane. George was the first official United States geologist in 1834, but his real claim to fame was promoting the building of the first steam-powered passenger train in America as early as 1812. By 1830, his dream happened at the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, a 16-mile route between Albany and Schenectady, New York. It was conceived to allow passengers on the Erie Canal to bypass the mighty Cohoes Falls between Albany and Schenectady. In 1893, a working model of the DeWitt Clinton engine and its cars was built for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago and is now in the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. It was on display and used during the 1909 New York Hudson Fulton celebration.
Eventually, the Mohawk and Hudson became the Albany and Schenectady Railroad and was taken over by the New York Central Railroad in 1853. Sometimes, pieces of the railroad are uncovered during road maintenance.
Bart McDougall told us General William North was an important figure in Duanesburg history. And I happen to know the owner of the General North Mansion not far from the church. So we're going to go for a visit and talk to David Vincent, who not only lives in the North Mansion, but he owns it as well. Hi, Dave.
Welcome again.
Hey, thanks. Good to see you.
Hi, Dave.
It's Justina.
So, could you tell us who was General William North?
Well, he was a soldier in the Revolution. He was born in Maine, grew up in Boston, and when the British closed the port of Boston in 1774, I believe, he joined up. And he was an educated man, became an officer, advanced through the ranks, was at one point appointed to the staff of Baron General von Steuben, as we know, we call him Steuben. And so he associated with the upper echelon and became a friend actually of Alexander Hamilton at that point.
That's fascinating.
So after the war, he lived in New York City. He was introduced to the mayor's daughter. The mayor was James Duane. He was a very prominent New Yorker. And the two courted and married in 1787. And Mr. Duane, Judge Duane, Mayor Duane gave them 1,000 acres here in Duanesburg for the purpose of living and constructing the house, which was constructed in 1791.
So you said with Steuben, so that's the Washington crowd. That's the
correct.
George Washington crowd.
Well, of course, Hamilton was Washington's aide-de-camp.
Right.
And North was Steuben's, one of his aide-de-camps.
So not bad.
Spent all their time together, it seemed like.
Yeah.
And so North was at the surrender of Cornwallis in Yorktown in 1781. And then, of course, the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783.
And so did he ever get involved in politics like Duane? Or?
North was very involved in politics. Upon moving here, it was, of course, just before the adoption of the Constitution in 1789. And North ran for and was elected as an assemblyman from Albany County. This was still Albany County. So he spent 3 terms in the assembly before Schenectady County was carved out of Albany County, which occurred in 1809. And then North was again elected to the assembly for 2 terms, and he ended up being Speaker of the Assembly 3 different times. He was also the first moderator of the Schenectady County, in those days it was the Board of Supervisors. So yeah, he was very involved.
And so you said he was related to Duane, so I'm assuming he married one of Duane's daughters?
Duane's
Or?
eldest daughter named Mary, yeah. And of course, Duane's wife was a Livingston. She was so Duane married into the Livingston family, which meant he was now, through marriage, aligned to certainly the most powerful political family in New York State. And so he was related through marriage to John Jay and other members of the power structure of the earliest days of our country. In fact, when he was mayor of New York City was the capital, the first capital of the United States. And I love to tell the story that when George Washington came to his inauguration, which was the very first inauguration, his wife did not accompany him. So James Duane's wife danced the first dance of the inauguration of the first president of the United States.
Really? Oh, that's a great story. Yeah, that's a bragging rights. I know that John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, Philip Schuyler, people like that were early, even though they all owned slaves. They were part of the group that created and I think James Duane created the New York Manumission Society, which was put together to abolish slavery, even though they owned slavery.
Yeah, North actually had one slave here in the 1790 census.
He did?
Yeah.
And did he free him, do you know? Or
I don't really know the story.
So tell us about the house,
Well, the house is federal style. The federal style grew out of, it's an English architectural style. It's called Adam in English, 2 brothers, the Adam brothers, who were architects in England. And so it was adopted, and we called it federal because it was a style that was most popular during the establishment of our federal government. So it was listed, it was identified in the Historic American Building Survey in 1932 or 33. So I have 3 photos that came from the Library of Congress. And then it was also listed on the National Register in the 1980s.
So, looking at this house, it actually reminds me a lot of Alexander Hamilton's house, which is in West Harlem. Is there any connection between the architecture of both of the houses?
I believe they're both federal, so they would share that similarity. But North knew Hamilton well. Hamilton did some legal work for William North up here. There's another whole connection involving a much more direct connection than simply having been in the upper echelon staff during the Revolution. In 1790, I can't remember exactly the date, there was a threat of war with France. The U.S. didn't have a very big army, and so Congress ordered President Adams to put together an army, fearing war with France. And actually, Hamilton was a warmonger. He wanted to go to war. Washington was asked to become head of the army, and he, of course, was retired as president, and he said, well, okay, you can call me the head of the army, but Hamilton will actually be the commanding general of the army. And so Hamilton needed generals below him, so he asked North to come. North had been appointed to a vacancy in the U.S. Senate, and he served 3 months approximately in the Senate when the capital was in Philadelphia. And while he was there, he voted for the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is an amazing document that I'm sure would never be passed today. Anyway, so he was already involved, and he agreed to become a general, and President Adams appointed him a brigadier general, and he served directly under Hamilton. There are about 50 pieces of correspondence between North and Hamilton during the 2 years that they feared war with France. The president was able to resolve, and his minions were able to resolve the conflict diplomatically, which I understand was not the way Hamilton wanted it to come out. But
that's ironic, since during the Revolution, France was our ally and helped us win the war.
the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Yeah.
But the
Politics
French are always for the French. Vive la France.
That's right. Boy, isn't that the truth?
It's actually the same with Polish peoples. Yeah.
Well, it's another sort of major figure from this area, Duanesburg, which when you drive through it, you know, it's this beautiful landscaped area, but you wouldn't think there was all this sort of American history packed into here. But George Featherstonehoff, who, you know, chartered the first steam-powered passenger train in America, and I understand he was also had some relation to Duane.
Well, he was North's brother-in-law. They both married daughters of James Duane. Both were given 1,000 acres. In fact, Duane had 5 offspring, 4 of whom actually built houses and lived here in Duanesburg. 2 of those houses have burned, the Featherstonehoff house and the house of Duane's only son, James Chatham Duane. For the moment, I couldn't remember his name. Who is buried, by the way, he and his wife are buried in the stockade in Schenectady behind the Episcopal Church.
Do you know much about the railroad history or Featherstonehoff's?
Yeah, well, you know, I've read the biography of Featherstonehoff, which was written maybe 15 or 20 years ago. It's a really remarkable document. I enjoyed reading it. Featherstonehoff was the first U.S. geologist.
Right.
He also surveyed the boundary between the U.S. and Canada up along New England and Maine. So, an interesting story. I mean, there's a lot of texture in that story that I can't just immediately recall.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just, again, you know, this area has such, when you think of the Revolution, that's one thing, but when you think about early technology and, you know, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, which is the first steam-powered passenger, I think he saw the first train in England or something.
He was a friend of Stephenson, the developer of the steam engine in England,
And then he came over here and said, well, we should do it in America.
Sure.
Yeah. And chartered the first steam-powered passenger train, Mohawk and Hudson Railroad.
So James Chatham Duane, who was Duane's son, he founded what was then the Mohawk Bank that became Mohawk National Bank, that ended up going to Fleet and on is now part of the Bank of America, right?
Oh, interesting.
So
And
first bank.
that was in the stockade, the Mohawk Bank.
North was on the board of directors of the bank. So it really was the Duane family that was the founding force of that bank. So interesting to weave in and through the industrial history of Schenectady as well, financial and industrial. And there's a lot more to it, but...
Well, I just find it fascinating that Duane, who didn't live here, and yet got all this acreage, and then decided that he wanted to make this the capital of New York State.
Well, a little bit of hubris, perhaps.
Yeah.
Duane actually, he served 5 years. He was the first mayor of New York after the Revolution. I believe he was mayor by appointment. I think there was a committee of appointment. And then he was obviously very close to Washington. And so when the Constitution was adopted and Washington becomes the first president, the capital of the U.S. is New York City, he asked Duane to become a federal judge. So Duane became the very first federal district court judge in American history. And the oldest court is still the New York City court. It was the very first one created. And when he retired from that, he had started building a house here in Duanesburg. And I believe North had taken that on as a project for his father-in-law. And it was going to be not far from the Christ Episcopal Church, but Duane died in 1797. The only thing that ever got constructed was the foundation. That's 60 feet by 48. It was a rather large structure, or would have been had it been.
Is that foundation still around? That
It
would make
is.
a great archaeological site.
I've actually walked it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like something we have to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a
Yeah.
new project.
So you're going to have to give us a tour then.
Well, I'll talk to a friend of mine who actually owns the site,
Oh, cool.
who would be happy to host us.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for. I mean, this has been a great tour, and it's such a beautiful place.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
The Great Western Turnpike enters Schoharie County as we cross the Schoharie Creek and travel to Esperance, New York, a small village of 343 residents. Esperance, which is French for hope, is famous for its once covered bridge and Ella's Cheese House. Esperance has a famous history about a witch who lived in the village in the 19th century.
Esperance was a major stop by people traveling west during the 19th century. Once a bustling community, hotels, mills and shops, churches, stagecoaches, wagons, and drovers with their herds and flocks of animals crowded the streets of this small community during the westward expansion of our country. Esperance today still retains its early charm along its main street.
Its famous covered bridge, built in 1812, saw revenue of over $1,000 a month, with pennies being charged for tolls.
We will stop at the Esperance Historical Society Museum, a former one-room schoolhouse, and talk to town historian Ken Jones. The schoolhouse is located in Esperance Commons and was granted to the village by General William North in 1820, whom we just learned about on our stop in nearby Duanesburg.
Ken, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Esperance?
Well, Esperance is a small village in the northeastern section of Schoharie County, and originally this was part of Native American or Aboriginal settlements for thousands of years along the Schoharie Creek, which is the border of Schoharie and Schenectady counties. In the European contact period around 1729, the first Palatines from the camps along the Hudson River came up here and settled, and were the first settlements, which was south of this village. This village was part of the Turnpike patent, which was by a family that were wealthy merchants in Albany. They established a survey of the properties in the 1790s, and around the same time, William North, who was the son-in-law of James Duane and kind of managing Duane's estate in Duanesburg, which is the next town over, was basically enthralled by the water power that was available here, and he thought here was a better site for a village than Duanesburg Corners, with the old Episcopal churches in Duanesburg. So he acquired from the Turnpike family this property in 1806. Previous to that, in 1792, William North was appointed one of the road commissioners for the Western District of New York, and one of the first acts that they did in 1792 was construct a highway through here to Cherry Valley, and put out bids for a bridge to be built across the Schoharie Creek. So in 1793, we had the first bridge probably built by the state of New York right here. And so then the place, of course, started to pick up. Instead of the Germans, you had New England people coming here, mainly congregational types from Connecticut and that area, Vermont, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Those were the type of people that settled along the Turnpike. They're mainly merchants. Some of these people had been in the United States for, generations, but they were connected by William North, who was originally from Boston and Maine. So he had connections with New England people and recruited them, and they settled in Esperance. Now, when the first bridge was built, it was only about 5 years old when the Schoharie Creek, which is a rambunctious, turns into a massive river during a high water event. So in 1798, there was a high water event and the bridge was washed out. And so the state of New York didn't have the money to maintain all the highways in New York State at that time or build all the bridges that were required for the growing state. So turnpike companies were formed, usually by people that would benefit from their property being along an improved highway. So again, William North steps into the picture and they form the Great Western Turnpike, which is now why you call Western Avenue in Albany gets its name. It's from the Great Western Turnpike that went from here to Cherry Valley. When that was done, they had a temporary bridge built until 1812 when the covered bridge was built. It was here for 118 years until they started tearing it down because it was too small for trucks to get through and ended up burning it down to quicken the destruction of it in 1930. So you had what became the Great Western Turnpike coming here. That covered bridge was so busy there was about 700 teams a day were crossing that bridge. And there were, in those days a toll was pennies, and they had 700, over $1,000 a month in tolls at that time, according to one of the old toll gate keepers, reported out. So it was a very busy highway. So there were eventually 5 stores and 5 hotels right here in the village. When they first came here, already there were some settlers here during the Revolution. During the Revolutionary War in Schoharie County, in 1780 was the major raid of the valley, where they came up south of here from Schoharie up through what is now Sloansville and went into towards Canajoharie Way and destroyed what was called Niskernsdorf, which was the furthest German settlement up this way from the old Palatine settlement was destroyed. So after that time, of course, it was harder to get people to buy into land. There was a lot of competition for, like the Livingstons were selling land and James Duane and all those. But William North was able to acquire this property and market it to people that he knew. So eventually he had a lot of shopkeepers, New England people, but the oldest settlers were still some of the old Germans from the Palatine and also some newer recruits. And one of them happened to be a man by the name of John Grantier. And John Grantier, by that name, was French and settled near the bridge. And around 1803, he passed away. And there's a story about his widow that she was bewitched. And so the New England people that were here, they were used to witch stories. In other words, Massachusetts, you had the witch trials. Well, Connecticut also had witch trials. So they had all this background. This woman supposedly was, there were various stories, depending on which version you like to hear. But the one common one is that she didn't speak English, only spoke French, and that the English people didn't trust her, and they watched her cross the creek without, by putting an apron down and pulling herself across without getting wet. And there were stories of her being present when there were problems with cattle dying. She was supposedly here when the original meeting house was built and there was a guy killed by drawing a log and having it fall on his leg. So they had all these stories to back up her execution, and they met and decided to shoot her. And there was a silversmith here in the village, and they shot her with a silver bullet and then buried her under a pine tree, and the pine tree roots were supposed to keep her from rising from the grave and coming back and haunting the people that had taken her out.
and this is the witch.
In the memory of a poor soul shot
I
and
know.
killed by a silver bullet in the belief that she was shot a witch.
Yeah, she looks pretty bad.
Oh, she looks like Marlene Dietrich.
And that's the teaspoon that they melted down to make the silver bullet.
She looks like Marlene.
Right.
So the villagers had a silversmith make a bullet from a silver spoon and shot the poor woman dead, all because she spoke French. Ironic, since the name Esperance is a French word for hope.
So this was the village people decided that they were
Well, the
gonna-
community, yeah, that's the story. There's also another story that's from Montgomery County, which is just to the north of us here, of a woman where there was missing cattle. And this guy found the cattle on this woman's property and shot her. And then the sheriff this is around the Revolutionary, just after the Revolutionary War, that version. And basically they came here, buried her, and then when they bent back across the creek, the guy that went with the sheriff, he was so heavy he fell off the horse and almost drowned, but he grabbed the horse's tail and made it across. But Sheriff Van Horn was supposedly the sheriff of Tryon County at the time and found the victim of lynch law, and they buried her there. So there's different versions of what happened to this poor lady, if she became a victim of lynch law and turned into a witch or not, because the earliest recorded one is a county history of Schoharie, very well regarded, written by Sims in 1845. So this was recorded, the first witch story, in 1845, and it's been repeated. I've got letters from people in the Midwest that said their family brought it over there in the 1850s, the story, so it's continued from generation to generation, and each one has put their little spin on it.
Do we know where she's buried?
Depending on which version you like,
Right.
there is one where she's buried near the intersection as you head for the Arboretum, which is north of here.
Right.
You'll see an intersection that goes Mountain Road and Conover Road, and right near that intersection is supposedly where is one version where she was buried. Now, if she was buried across the creek, she would have been buried on the Duanesburg side to prevent her, because the New England people were here on the Schoharie County side. So again, it depends on which version you like, where she was buried. And if you do the genealogy, you'll find that Grand Tier married a Niskern, and that was the Niskernsdorf German. So she would have spoken German. Again, you had New England people, you had a culture clash where you had these New England people that were Congregationalists, okay, compared to your Lutheran and Reformed, German people. So, there was a lot of them didn't mix. In other words, the Palatines that were down here and Germans on the hill didn't mix in the early days with the New England people here. They kept to themselves. They had German language, German religion. They didn't speak, a lot of English even, in later generations. And if you read old stories about people coming through Schoharie, it was kind of like a spooky place, when they went through where the Germans were and everything. So there was a lot of stories and folklore all around these early Palatine settlers that were here first.
Did they ever arrest anybody for the murder? Or?
Not that I'm aware of, but in Sims' history, he said a man by the name of Rector shot her. And rectors are still common name, out in the area. One of our church organists, when I was a little kid, her name was Rector. But I didn't know at the time the story. But anyway, supposedly he's the one that shot her. And then the family said there was no truth to it and blah, blah, blah,
Right.
That kind of a thing. So there's several, like I said, several different versions. You read the history of Montgomery and Fulton County, there you'll hear about the sheriff and finding the woman who shot for stealing cattle, because in those days, stealing cattle was a big deal. And during the Revolution, they used to steal cattle and then they'd sell them to either side. That's where the cowboys came from. They called them cowboys, these people that rustled cattle during the Revolutionary period. Sold them to either the British or the American side, whoever gave them the money for the cows, So eventually, William North wanted to create a great village, and this was marketed in the Albany papers, and it was called a hotbed promotion. In other words, he had everything here you needed: mills, brickyards, all those things were here that you would need if you were going to build. They even put a huge stone pier near the creek so people could build their mills right on this pier, along the creek for water power. So it was very well marketed in the Albany papers. And eventually, it became an incorporated village in 1818. It grew that much. I think you needed 100 people to have an incorporated village at that time. And around that time also, they acquired an old fire engine called the Deluge, which the story goes, and this again is a story, that it was originally purchased by New York City in 1738 in that era, and used by New York City and eventually sold to Schenectady, and then William North acquired it from Schenectady and gave it to Esperance. Esperance acquired it somewhere around 1815, which was even before we were incorporated, and used it for about 70 years. And then eventually it was turned over to the Stone Fort in Schoharie in 1889. When that opened, it was one of the first items to make its way in there. And what's interesting is in the village records, the village meetings, they're being petitioned by the residents to sell the fire engines because the fire department, even though it had been originally formed by appointment by the village. In other words, they were by law, when the incorporation was formed, is mainly incorporated for fire protection. That's why the village was incorporated, so they could recruit 20 residents and say, you're going to be on the fire brigade, basically, and you're going to protect this, and we're going to have tax authority so we can raise money to build the firehouse and that kind of thing. So what happened was that fire engine and the fire department kind of got little use towards the middle of the 1880s, and the village residents said they acquired a second one from Albany called, what was it called? The Premier. And so they had these two fire engines, and they said, sell them, give it to the taxpayers to reduce our taxes because the fire department's not active. And then in 1885 was a major fire, and they used the fire engine and decided they needed new fire equipment. They reorganized the fire department, bought uniforms and all that, and then they put that old Deluge into the Stone Fort. And that one's run by bucket brigade. There's no suction valve on that one, so it had to be run by people running buckets to a well or down into the creek. There were about 6 or 8 wells drilled, not drilled, but hand dug here in the village, so that anywhere in the village they could get close enough to a well to fill the cascade. And then when they got the cascade, that was a suction engine in 1885. It was made in Waterford, New York, by the Button Engine Company. And that one, they ran hoses into the different wells so they could fight a fire wherever it happened to be in the village. Another thing, you mentioned that when you got here, you said that you mentioned the stone church that's here. William North, one of the things he did, in those days, you didn't buy your land, you rented it. So everything here in the village was rented through William North. He would lease you the land, and you would pay him a certain dollar rent, like $17.50 to like $60 possibly for a mill site per year. And you would pay this rent in perpetuity, and that's what eventually led to the anti-rent wars in the 1840s. But anyway, people rented land here right up until the 1940s. There was still this even though the New York State Constitution outlawed these leases in perpetuity, it wasn't retroactive. So all these leases that were here in the village continued until people bought out the heirs of William North, and then they had a free, clear title. What he did in 1820 is he set aside this 2-acre lot where we're on right now as a village commons, and set it aside for village church and educational purposes. So that's why the schoolhouse is located here, and the stone church. Stone church was erected in 1823-24, and during the time it was erected, a famous eccentric preacher by the name of Lorenzo Dow, who was a Methodist preacher, was not fully ordained because he was so eccentric. They had rules. He was supposed to stay behind the pulpit and do different things, but he was basically a field preacher. He would show up and say, well, next year at this point I'm going to show up at this spot, and people would trust him. They'd show up and he would be there and give them, a very interesting sermon. So he showed up here when the building was under construction, and most of the people here, like I said, are Connecticut Congregationalists, and even knew him from back in Connecticut days. So he was familiar with the people here. When the church was fully dedicated on July 4th of 1824. It was used for mainly religious purposes, and also they could use it for other purposes as well, meetings or what have you. But one of the interesting members of the church was Sheldon Jackson, and he joined the church as an infant when he was baptized. His parents were from Minaville in Montgomery County, and basically they came over here and eventually operated a store in Esperance and became involved in the church. And after they became members, they said they were going to dedicate their son to the ministry. So Sheldon grew up with the idea that he was going to be a minister. He was kind of a short stature kind of a guy. He was hoping to become a foreign minister, a foreign missionary, and all the excitement that goes with that. He went to Union College and then to Princeton Seminary. And when it was time for his appointment, he was hoping to go overseas, and he thought he was too small and frail for that, so they sent him down to the Choctaw Mission down in Oklahoma territory. And eventually he was like a superintendent starting churches in the West. And his superiors were not happy with him because he was always ahead of them, building the next church. And he was doing this on a regular basis. He had special passes to ride the stagecoaches, and he was a very good marketer. He had his own newspaper called the Rocky Mountain Presbyterian, and he would go to the New York City people, women's groups, and when he thought they would, cough up money, he would, market his approach and tell them that he needed money for this Western work that he was doing. He did a lot of that work in the Midwest. Then in 1877, he went to Alaska and eventually started the first schools in Alaska. And because there was marketing of the women, the native peoples, native women were being sold into prostitution, and he fought that, ended up in jail at one time because of it, but the President of the United States was a Presbyterian, helped him get out of jail. But he eventually started more schools and churches in Alaska and had the idea, because the caribou were getting scarce from overhunting, to bring Laplanders over to train the native peoples on raising reindeer. So he brought reindeer from Siberia to Alaska and started them raising reindeer like you would raise cattle. And became, very famous in Alaska for all that work. He became the what they call a moderator of the General Assembly one year for the Presbyterian Church USA, which is the highest, appointment they can give you, a high honor within the church. And he continued to do that right up until he died in 1908. They said if there was a statue to put in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. to represent the state of Alaska, it should be Sheldon Jackson. That's how much work he did. The bookcase behind you is full of his original reports from his own collection of the reindeer reports he gave to the federal government, the education reports, and books. And there's a lot of books, biographies on his work, written by different authors, even children's books. He was very, very famous during his time frame that he was active. And basically, he became a Union College worthy, and they have a portrait of him at Union College, and there's markers in the entranceway to this church that are put up by historical groups and the New York State to commemorate his work in Alaska.
Wow, that's a lot of history for such a small area.
Right, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we had people here that ran for governor, and we had a state controller that lived here. There were county, people who were county judges. One of the gentlemen here was involved in, I think it's called Broadway in the Bronx, where the Yankee Stadium was originally, that main thoroughfare. He was involved in getting that built, and people have come here to do research on various topics. And we go way back. In other words, there's the native peoples. They're doing 2 digs right now in Central Bridge area that they've been doing for years. There's such a rich treasure trove of pre-contact materials that they've been able to do this, for many, many years. The University of Albany and the Iroquois Museum are both continuously doing digs in the Central Bridge area. So the place is very old, even from, a regular settlement before even the first white men were here.
American history was not just made in the large urban cities across the country. What was demonstrated today is that people who lived in small rural communities also contributed in major ways to help create and shape the American experience. So that was Esperance, New York. We hope you enjoyed that adventure.
And we will see you again on History on the Road. History on the Road.
That was good. One more.
Yeah.
Your changes and stuff were totally like psychotic. We should do just a warmer one, not just one
Warmer
level.
one? Okay.
You were like off the wall.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yes.
At the end, it was like a serial killer coming for us, for sure. For History on the Road. All right.